There is a moment that happens somewhere in the middle of Hell Week where the human brain stops functioning the way it normally does. It is not exhaustion in the way most people understand exhaustion. It is something deeper, something that reaches into the part of you that decides who you are. Your hands have stopped working properly. Your eyes will not stay open no matter how hard you fight them. Your body has been wet and cold and sandy for so long that you cannot remember what dry feels like. And somewhere in that fog, with an instructor screaming in your face and the Pacific Ocean trying to kill you in January, you make a decision. You either stay or you quit. And if you quit, you walk over to that brass bell hanging in the middle of the compound, and you ring it 3 times. That bell is one of the most famous objects in American military history, and the moment your hand touches it, everything changes. Not just for that day, for the rest of your career, and in ways that most people never fully understand, for the rest of your life. Today we are going deep inside what actually happens when a candidate fails military selection. Not just Navy SEAL Bud Sess, but the Army's Special Forces Assessment and Selection, the Marine Raiders, Air Force Combat Controllers, and the British SAS. What happens to those men after they fail? Where do they go? What does the military do with them? Can they try again? And what does the psychological weight of that decision actually look like years down the road? Because here is the thing that nobody talks about. The men who ring that bell are not always the weakest candidates in the class. Sometimes they are among the strongest, and what happens to them after is a story that the recruiting posters never tell you. If you have ever respected the men who put themselves through these programs, type iron in the comments right now. Let's start from the beginning. Let's start with the bell. Before you can understand what failure means in military selection, you have to understand what these programs are actually designed to do. Because most people think selection week is about finding the toughest, most physically capable candidates. That is not entirely wrong, but it is also not entirely right. The Army Special Forces qualification course begins with an assessment and selection phase that runs roughly 24 days at Fort Bragg, now known as Fort Liberty in North Carolina. The physical demands are severe. Candidates ruck dozens of miles with heavy loads across undulating terrain, sometimes in brutal heat, sometimes in freezing rain. Sleep is a commodity that almost does not exist, but the physical piece is only one layer of what is being tested. Navy SEAL Bud SLE PARS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL Training, runs 6 months total, with the most famous phase being Hell Week, 5.5 days. Roughly 132 hours of continuous operation on almost no sleep in wet, cold conditions. Candidates run, paddle, carry boats, do physical training, carry logs, and operate in the Pacific Ocean in January, where the water temperature hovers around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Prolonged immersion in that temperature will kill a human being. The training program uses that edge deliberately. Marine Raiders, formerly known as the Marine Special Operations Command, run their own assessment and selection phase, 2 weeks of screaming physical and mental evaluation, followed by an individual training course that runs over a year. Air Force Combat Controllers, arguably the least well-known and most technically demanding of all special operations pipelines, run candidates through a selection process, followed by years of training in combat control, air traffic control, jump school, combat diving, and more. The British SAS selection, held in the Brecon Beacons Mountains of Wales, is considered by many military professionals to be the single most brutal selection course run by any military on Earth. Candidates ruck enormous distances alone across exposed mountain terrain in Welsh winter weather, carrying weights that would hospitalize most professional athletes. The final event, called the Long Drag or Endurance, covers 40 miles across the Beacons with a 55-pound Bergen plus water and rifle, all within a strict time limit. What all of these programs share is a philosophy that goes far beyond fitness. They are looking for something specific inside a person's character that cannot be manufactured, cannot be faked, and cannot be substituted with strength alone. They are looking for a man who does not break when breaking would be the easiest thing in the world. Now, before we go any further, take 2 seconds and subscribe if you are not already. More than 97% of people watching this right now have not subscribed. It costs you nothing and means everything. Now let's talk about what happens in the actual moment of failure. The act of quitting selection is not the chaotic, dramatic collapse that movies tend to portray. In most cases, It is quiet, it is personal, and it happens inside the candidate's head before it ever becomes physical. In BUD, the bell is the symbol everyone knows. It sits in the center of the Naval Special Warfare Training Compound in Coronado, California. Next to the bell is a row of helmets. Each helmet belongs to a student currently in training. When a student quits, they ring the bell 3 times, then they place their helmet in that row. During Hell Week, that row of helmets grows. On some days, it grows quickly. The instructors do not beg candidates to quit. They do not beg them to stay either. The entire atmosphere is engineered so that quitting feels like the only rational option. The cold makes it logical. The sleep deprivation makes it urgent. The physical suffering makes it medically defensible. And yet most of the men who ring that bell in the first 3 days of Hell Week are not physically broken. Their bodies still work. Their muscles still function. The decision to ring the bell comes from somewhere above the neck. This is the crucial piece of the puzzle. In Army SFOS, there is no bell. But there is a process that is equally definitive. A candidate who decides he cannot continue approaches the cadre, the instructors and evaluators running the course, and he voluntarily withdraws. There is paperwork. There is a brief conversation, and then he is out. In SAS selection, the dropout procedure is equally simple. You approach the directing staff, you say you are withdrawing, and it is over. There is no negotiation. There is no system for changing your mind 20 minutes later. Once you are out, you are out. For that course, on that attempt, the act itself takes seconds. The consequences last years. Now let's talk about what actually happens in the hours and days immediately following a failed selection attempt, because this is where the practical reality of military service comes back into focus very quickly. You are still in the military. That is the first thing every candidate who fails has to process. You did not resign from the Army when you quit SFOS. You did not separate from the Navy when you rang the bell at BUDC. You are still a soldier, still a sailor, still a Marine, still an airman. You still have a service obligation. You still have a rank. And now you have to figure out what comes next. For Navy BUDS candidates, the process after quitting or being medically dropped has a formal structure. Students who fail BUDS are sent back to the fleet. This means they are reassigned to a conventional Navy unit, a surface ship, a submarine, a shore command, wherever the needs of the Navy dictate. They receive orders like any other sailor. They go. The specific assignment depends on their original rating, which is the Navy's term for a sailor's job specialty, and on the timing of their failure within the pipeline. A student who entered BUDSAS as an undesignated seaman with no prior rating may have very limited control over where he ends up. A student who already had a rating before attempting BUDS typically returns to that community. What this means in practical terms is that a man who spent months, sometimes years, preparing for BUDS, who drove himself through one of the most punishing physical and mental gauntlets in military history, and who failed, wakes up the next week aboard a destroyer or at a shore installation doing the job of a conventional Navy sailor. That transition is not gentle. It is not cushioned by counseling or by any formal emotional support structure. The military is not a therapist's office. You failed selection. You have orders. Report aboard. For Army candidates who fail SFOS, the process is similar in outcome. They return to their original branch or to whatever assignment the Army determines is appropriate. A candidate who was an infantryman before attempting selection returns to an infantry unit. A candidate who was in signal or logistics returns to those communities. The Army does not create special holding patterns for people who failed to make special forces. You tried. You did not make it. Here is your next assignment. Go be a soldier. The Marine Raider pipeline works the same way. Marine candidates who fail return to the operating forces. They go back to infantry units, to the Fleet Marine Force, to conventional Marine assignments. The Air Force Combat Controller pipeline, because of how long and technically complex it is, has some additional processing steps, but the fundamental outcome is the same. You go back to the conventional Air Force. The British Army handles SAS failures slightly differently in one specific respect. The selection course draws candidates from across the regular Army, from infantry regiments, armored units, signals, engineers. When a candidate fails, he returns to his parent unit, his regiment, his battalion, This matters enormously in the British Army context because the regiment is everything. Your identity in the British Army is tied deeply to your regiment. Returning to the Parachute Regiment, or the Royal Marines, or the Welsh Guards, after failing SAS selection, means returning to men who know exactly what you attempted and exactly what happened. The social and professional weight of that return is something British veterans describe with careful understatement, which in British culture means it was brutal. Now we need to talk about something that military recruiters and special operations commands do not put in their promotional materials. We need to talk about the psychological reality of failing selection. Because in the years following Hell Week, in the years following SFOS, in the years following that walk across the Brecon Beacons that ended before the finish line, something happens inside these men that is complex, painful, and extraordinarily common. The military builds selection programs that are explicitly designed to find the limit of a person's will. That is the entire philosophical foundation of Hell Week, of the long drag, of the 40-mile rucks in the Brecon Beacons. They are not trying to teach you skills in those moments. They are trying to find the exact point at which you break. And if you break, they have found something. They have found the edge of you, and you have found it too. For many men, that discovery does not feel liberating. It feels like a wound. There is a specific kind of suffering that comes from learning that you reached the end of yourself, and the end came sooner than you needed it to. Men who fail selection frequently describe a period of what can only be called grief. Grief is not too strong a word. They grieve the identity they had built around the goal. They grieve the version of themselves they were certain they were going to become. They grieve the team they were going to be part of. The brotherhood they glimpsed before it was taken away. Clinical psychologists who work with special operations candidates and with veterans describe this as a form of identity disruption. For many of these men, becoming a SEAL or a Green Beret or an SAS operator was not just a career goal. It was the central organizing principle of their identity for years, sometimes for their entire adult life. When that goal disappears, the psychological scaffolding that their entire sense of self was built on collapses at once. What fills the space matters enormously, and the military, for all its remarkable qualities, is not always equipped to help fill that space constructively. There is a culture in special operations communities, and honestly in the conventional military as well, that treats psychological struggle as weakness. Men who talk about feeling lost after failing selection are not always met with compassion by their peers. Sometimes they are met with indifference, sometimes with contempt, sometimes with a version of the attitude that says you quit, stop talking about it, and get back to work. This cultural reality makes the post-failure period more dangerous, not less, because the men who go through it tend to go through it silently, and silent grief is almost always more corrosive than expressed grief. Veterans who failed BUD/CS and went back to the fleet describe a period of professional disorientation that lasted months. They were surrounded by sailors who had never attempted special operations selection, who had no frame of reference for what they had just experienced, and who in some cases treated the returned BODC's dropout with something between pity and dismissal. One veteran described it this way: "Everyone knew I had tried and failed. Nobody said anything about it directly, but it was always there. In every introduction, in every conversation where someone asked what I did before my current command, it was always there." Army veterans who return to conventional infantry units after failing SFOS describe a similar dynamic, with an additional layer of complexity. Infantry units that send candidates to SFOS expect results. There is a culture of expectation and a culture of pride attached to producing Special Forces soldiers. When a candidate returns having failed, the unit's reaction is not always charitable. Some veterans describe returning to units where the failure was treated as a reflection on the unit itself, as if the candidate had embarrassed his battalion by not making the grade. This attitude, as unfair and psychologically damaging as it is also completely predictable within the culture of highly competitive combat arms communities. Now let's talk about something that cuts against the simple narrative of failure, because the reality of who fails selection is more complicated than most people think. And understanding this changes everything about how we should interpret the bell, the withdrawal, the walk back to the regular military. The dropout rates for elite military selection programs are staggering. In BUD/S, the historical attrition rate is approximately 70 to 80%. Some Hell Week classes have seen attrition above 90%. The Army's SFOS historically drops or recycles a substantial proportion of candidates, with some estimates placing the failure rate above 50%. SAS selection has historically passed single-digit percentages of candidates in some selection cycles. What this means is that the men who fail these programs are not, as a statistical matter, a collection of the weak and unprepared. They are predominantly a collection of men who were fit enough, dedicated enough, and serious enough to make it to the course in the first place. Getting to BUD/S is itself a significant achievement. The physical screening tests required just to enter the pipeline are beyond what most professional athletes can accomplish. A man who passes those screening tests, survives Hell Week's first 24 hours, and then rings the bell on day 3, has already demonstrated a level of physical and mental capability that exceeds the vast majority of human beings. But that does not make the bell ring any less, and it does not make the return to the fleet any easier. Here is the part that is rarely discussed in the stories about special operations culture. Some of the men who ring that bell go on to extraordinary careers in the conventional military. Some go on to earn combat decorations that rival anything their BUD/S classmates earned. Some go on to become commanding officers of surface ships, senior non-commissioned officers in the Army, accomplished military leaders in every branch. The failure of selection did not define them, even when it felt for years like it would. And some go back. This is crucial. The ability to attempt selection again is one of the most important and least publicized facts about military special operations pipelines. BOD/S allows candidates to attempt the course again after a failed voluntary withdrawal, subject to command approval, physical readiness standards, and time in service restrictions. The Army allows SFOS candidates to attempt the course a second time in most cases. The British SAS has historically allowed a second attempt for candidates who fail on their first try, though the standards are identical, and the course does not get easier the second time. The reattempt is not guaranteed. It is not automatic, and it is not easy to secure. A candidate who quit BUD/S during Hell Week and wants to try again typically faces a mandatory waiting period, a requirement to demonstrate continued physical readiness, and the willingness of his current command to support another attempt. Not all commands are willing. Some commanding officers are supportive of giving sailors another shot at selection. Others are not, either because of the manning disruption it causes or because of a personal judgment about the candidate's likelihood of success. But the possibility exists, and for some men, that possibility is everything. The men who go back to BUD/S having failed once describe a categorically different experience the second time. Not because the course is different. It is the same course, the same cold water, the same instructors, the same bell. But the candidate is different. He has already been to the end of himself once. He already knows where his limit was, and in preparing to return he has spent months, sometimes years, systematically working to move that limit further. Veterans who passed BUD/S on their second or third attempt frequently describe the first failure as the most important thing that ever happened to them professionally, not because failure is instructive in some abstract motivational sense, but because hitting the specific, personal, honest wall that selection builds, and then choosing to walk back toward it, taught them something about their own psychology that no amount of success ever could have. The SAS has produced some of its most decorated operators from men who failed selection the first time. The Green Beret community is full of men who were recycled or who voluntarily withdrew from SFOS and came back. The willingness to return is itself a piece of data about character. Now let's talk about the men who do not go back. Because they are the majority. Most men who fail military selection do not attempt the course a second time. Some cannot due to age restrictions, service obligations, or physical injuries sustained during the attempt. Some choose not to, for reasons that are entirely personal and entirely valid. And some spend years in a complicated psychological relationship with that choice, asking themselves a version of the same question over and over. What if I had stayed? That question is one of the most persistent and painful features of the post-selection experience that veterans describe. The what if stays. Not always in the foreground, not always consciously, but it stays. Men who failed BUD/S 20 years ago, who went on to have successful careers in the Navy, and who have built full lives outside the military, will still occasionally describe a moment where something triggers the memory of the bell. A movie, a news story about special operations, a conversation with a stranger who asks if they were ever in the military, and the what if surfaces again. This is not unique to military selection. It is a feature of every major fork in the road that human beings take. But there is something specific about military selection failure that gives the what if particular sharpness. Because the decision to ring the bell was made in the worst possible conditions, under maximum physical and psychological stress, in a moment when almost nothing inside you was functioning clearly. And the question that haunts men years later is not whether they were good enough in their everyday life. It is whether they would have been good enough if they had held on for one more hour, if they had refused to quit for one more evolution, if the person they became in the years after failure had been the person on that beach in Coronado. Some veterans resolve this question and find peace with their answer. Others carry it. The ones who go back and pass describe the resolution as total. They say that passing on the second attempt did not just close the question of whether they could do it. It answered a deeper question about who they were. The ones who do not go back and who make peace with that choice frequently describe a moment of genuine self-honesty that was, in its own way, as defining as passing would have been. They looked at the question clearly, decided the answer was no, and built their life on what was actually true rather than on what they wished were true. That kind of honesty takes its own form of courage. But we also need to talk about the men for whom neither of those resolutions happens cleanly. The men who neither go back nor fully make peace, who carry the failure as a weight that does not diminish with time, who define themselves by what they did not become in a way that prevents them from becoming what they could be. These men exist. They are more common than the special operations community publicly acknowledges, and they represent one of the more serious and under-addressed consequences of a selection culture that is designed to identify psychological limits, but that provides almost no framework for what happens to the men who find their limit. The military's approach to this population is essentially non-existent. There is no formal program for helping failed selection candidates process the experience. There is no standard counseling protocol. There are no peer support groups built into the post-selection pipeline. You fail, you return to your unit, and whatever happens in your head is your private business. This is a gap. It is a significant gap, and veterans who have been on both sides of it, those who failed and struggled, and those who failed and found their footing relatively quickly, frequently point to the same variable. The ones who navigated it best had someone. A senior NCO who had been through selection himself, a chaplain who understood the specific psychology involved, a peer who had experienced the same thing, a mentor who told them the truth about what failure in this context actually meant and did not mean. The ones who struggled most were alone with it. Now let's go deeper into something that the traditional narrative about special operations selection almost never addresses. Let's talk about the candidates who do not fail by choice. Because among the men who leave BUD-SES, who leave SFAS, who leave SAS selection without completing the course, a significant number did not ring the bell voluntarily. They were dropped. Medical drops are the largest single category of non-completion in most elite selection pipelines. Hell Week produces an extraordinary volume of medical issues. Stress fractures in the feet and legs are extraordinarily common. The combination of cold water immersion, sleep deprivation, and continuous physical activity creates conditions where the human body's immune system becomes severely compromised. Hypothermia is a constant threat. Rhabdomyolysis, a breakdown of muscle tissue that releases proteins into the bloodstream and can cause kidney failure, is a documented risk. Pneumonia has ended more than one BUD-S candidate's Hell Week. The medical staff at BUD-S training is authorized to pull candidates from the course against their will if the medical risk is deemed too serious. This is not a hypothetical. It happens in almost every Hell Week class. And for the men it happens to, the psychological aftermath is profoundly different from those who quit voluntarily, and in some ways more difficult. A man who rings the bell made a choice. He owns that choice. He can examine it, understand it, fight with it, and ultimately reconcile himself to it because it was his. A man who was medically dropped made no choice. The decision was made for him by a corpsman or a doctor who determined that continuing would put his life or his long-term health at serious risk. These men frequently describe a form of unfinished business that is qualitatively different from the experience of voluntary withdrawal. They did not find their limit. Their body found a wall that had nothing to do with their will. And the question of whether they could have made it, whether they had the mental toughness that selection is designed to find, remains permanently unanswered. The military's pipeline for medically dropped candidates includes specific provisions for re-entry in most cases, depending on the nature of the injury, the recovery timeline, and command support. A candidate who was dropped from Hell Week with a stress fracture, heals completely, and demonstrates continued physical readiness may be invited back to the course. But the bureaucratic and administrative path to that re-entry is not always straightforward. And the emotional experience of returning to a course from which you were removed involuntarily is described by veterans who have done it as uniquely complex. You are not returning to prove something to yourself in the same way a voluntary dropout is. You are returning to finish something that was unfinished, which is both simpler and, in some ways, harder. Now let's talk about the broader career arc of men who fail selection, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. The conventional wisdom, reinforced by special operations culture, is that the men who pass selection are the best the military has. And that wisdom is not wrong exactly. The men who pass BOD and go on to become SEAL operators are extraordinary. The men who pass SFOS and complete the Special Forces qualification course and earn the Green Beret are extraordinary. The operators of the British SAS are among the most capable soldiers any military has ever produced. But the corollary of that wisdom, that the men who fail selection are therefore somehow less, is where things get more complicated. The conventional military is full of exceptional soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen who attempted special operations selection and did not make it. Full of them. The Army has infantry battalion commanders who failed SFOS. The Navy has senior chiefs and master chiefs who rang the bell at BOD's S. The Marine Corps has regimental commanders who washed out of the Raider pipeline, and in many cases, the specific qualities that made them attempt selection in the first place, the drive, the physical capability, the willingness to push past discomfort, were the exact qualities that made them excellent conventional military leaders afterward. This is one of the great ironies of the selection system. It is so good at attracting exceptional candidates that even its failures produce better than average conventional warriors. The Army knows this. The Navy knows this. The British Army knows this. And each of these institutions, at some level, benefits from having men who attempted elite selection and returned to the conventional force, because those men bring a particular intensity and standard of performance with them. They are not diminished by the attempt. In many cases, they are sharpened by it. But this does not mean the experience is without cost. And it does not mean the professional path after failure is always smooth. Because in the culture of combat arms, in the culture of the special operations community, in the specific subculture of the units that produce and receive selection candidates, the failure carries social weight that is real and persistent. Men who failed BUDS and returned to the surface Navy describe being seen differently by peers who had never attempted the course. Not necessarily worse, different, as if they exist in a specific category that is neither conventional sailor nor failed SEAL, but something else, something without a clean label. The military is a culture of categories and labels. When you fit neatly into a category, the system works efficiently around you. When you do not, there is friction. And the man who attempted BUDS and came back to the fleet does not fit neatly. He is not a SEAL. He is also not the person he would have been if he had never tried. He is something else. Working out who that something else is, and finding a way to inhabit that identity with confidence, is one of the central psychological challenges of the post-selection period. The men who do it well tend to do it by connecting what they attempted and what they learned in the attempt to the work they are doing in the conventional military. They find a way to carry the experience forward rather than carrying it as a burden. They are the senior chief petty officers who hold their sailors to a standard that most NCOs would not dare demand, because they personally know what human beings are capable of when they are pushed. They are the infantry company commanders who know exactly how tired a soldier can actually get before he genuinely cannot continue, because they have been to that place and passed it. They are defined by the attempt, not by the outcome of the attempt. And that distinction between being defined by your attempts and being defined by your outcomes is one of the most important psychological ideas in the entire world of high-performance military culture. Let's talk now about something that very few people outside special operations circles know about: the way the special operations community itself views its own selection dropout culture, because it is more nuanced than the public narrative suggests. Inside the teams, meaning the SEAL community, there is a well-known and openly acknowledged respect for men who attempted BODS and failed, particularly Hell Week. Not universal respect, not unconditional respect, but a recognition that the attempt itself is not nothing. SEALs who have been through Hell Week know exactly what they asked of themselves to get through it. They know exactly what it cost. And they know that the man who rang the bell on day 4 of Hell Week was in the same ocean, the same cold, the same darkness, the same suffering, and made a different choice. They may not always say this out loud. The culture of selection celebrates completion, not attempt, but the private acknowledgement exists. The British SAS culture is, interestingly, more formally generous in this regard. The directing staff at Hereford has a phrase that is used in various forms across generations of selection. They separate failure of selection from failure as a person in a way that is more explicit than most American military cultures manage. Passing SAS selection proves specific things. It proves you can perform at a specific physical and psychological level under specific conditions on a specific course on specific days. Failing selection does not disprove those things. It simply leaves them unconfirmed. This is not the same thing. That distinction sounds subtle. It is not. It is the difference between a man who knows he is capable and a man who knows he did not make it through. Those are not the same man. And the British military, at least at the level of SAS culture, has a slightly more sophisticated vocabulary for articulating that difference. Now let's bring this back to where we started, to the bell, to the moment of decision, to what actually happens in the hours and days and years after that moment. Because for all of the bureaucratic and institutional machinery that processes failed selection candidates, the thing that matters most happens inside one man's head. And it begins the night after he fails. That night is described consistently across accounts from veterans who have been through it. There is a silence to it. The physical suffering that has been your entire world for days or weeks or months is gone, or at least subsiding, and in its place is a stillness that is almost disorienting. You ate. You slept. You are warm for the first time, and in that warmth and stillness your mind comes back online, and the first thing it does is replay the decision. Every veteran who has failed selection and spoken honestly about it describes this replay, not as a brief review but as a sustained, detailed, relentless examination of the moment. What was happening in your body when you decided to quit? What your mind was telling you? Whether the pain was as bad as it felt or whether you had more left? Whether the next evolution would have broken you anyway, or whether you might have made it through. The replay does not come with easy answers. It comes with questions. Questions about who you are. Questions about what you are capable of. Questions about whether the version of yourself you thought you were is real, or whether that version was always a story you were telling yourself. These are not comfortable questions, but they are important questions. And the men who engage them honestly, rather than burying them or rationalizing them away, tend to come out the other side with something rare and valuable. A clear and honest knowledge of themselves. Not the idealized self-image that most of us walk around with, but the actual self. The one with specific limits and specific strengths and specific fears that are real rather than hypothetical. Most human beings go their entire lives without ever finding their actual limit. They approximate it. They guess at it. But they never truly hit the wall that selection builds, the wall that is specifically designed to find the exact edge of what a person can endure. The men who fail selection have found that wall. It was not where they hoped it would be, but they know where it is. And that knowledge, as painful as it is knowledge that most human beings never acquire. What you do with that knowledge is the question. The men who use it, who look at the wall and decide to build themselves so the wall is further away next time, or who look at the wall and decide to apply that knowledge of themselves to a different domain with equal honesty and intensity, those men turn failure into something that functions like fuel. The men who turn away from the knowledge, who decide that the wall was unfair, or that the conditions were wrong, or that they were sick that week, or that the instructors had it in for them, those men miss the entire point of what selection was trying to teach them, and they carry the failure as a wound that never heals, rather than as a scar that tells a true story. Before we get to the final piece of this, the part that is about something even larger than individual psychology, subscribe if you have not already. Hit the like button. This kind of research and storytelling takes real time and real work, and your support is what makes it possible. Now, the last thing we need to talk about is something that the military selection culture almost never says out loud, but that the data makes clear. Not everyone is supposed to pass. This sounds obvious when you say it plainly. Of course not everyone is supposed to pass. The whole point of selection is to select. But the cultural messaging around special operations, the way it is packaged by the military in recruiting materials, the way it is portrayed in popular culture, and in the first-person accounts that get published and celebrated, creates an implicit message that the right kind of person, the person who wants it enough, the person who prepares correctly, will pass. That message is not accurate. Hell Week is designed to pass approximately 20 to 30% of candidates on any given attempt. SFOS is designed to select a fraction of its candidates. SAS selection passes single digits in some cycles. These are not programs designed for widespread success. They are programs designed for radical selectivity, which means that the majority of the people who attempt them, including people who are physically extraordinary, who prepared for years, who genuinely wanted it with everything they had, will fail. Not because they were the wrong kind of person, not because they did not prepare enough, but because selection is designed to be failed by most people, because the job on the other side of selection requires the tiny minority who are going to make it through no matter what. This is important. This matters, because it means that failure in selection is not primarily a verdict on the quality of the person. It is primarily a sorting function for a specific type of role that requires a specific distribution of human qualities in a specific combination that is extraordinarily rare. The bell does not mean you are not a warrior. It does not mean you are not courageous. It does not mean you are not capable of extraordinary things. It means that on that day, in that water, at that temperature, with that many hours without sleep and that many miles on your legs, the precise combination of attributes that gets a human being through Hell Week was not available in sufficient quantity to get you to Friday. That is a narrow verdict. And the men who understand how narrow it is, and who refuse to let a narrow verdict become a broad indictment of who they are the ones who come out of failure with something intact and useful. The ones who let the narrow verdict become broad, who hear the bell as a verdict on their entire character and their entire worth, are the ones who carry unnecessary damage for unnecessary years. The military should do more to help its candidates hear the narrow verdict rather than the broad one. It largely does not. That is a gap worth naming. But in the absence of institutional support for this, the responsibility falls on the men themselves and on the communities around them to tell the true story, which is this. You attempted something that most human beings on Earth would never dare try. You pushed yourself to a place where almost no one ever goes. You found the edge of yourself at your absolute worst, at your coldest, your most exhausted, your most sleep-deprived, your most broken. And what you found there does not define you in full. It is one data point. It is an important data point, but it is not the whole story. The whole story is still being written. For every man who rang that bell and went on to ring out from special operations training, there is a man who rang it and went on to serve 20 years in the conventional military with distinction. For every man who failed SFOS and never tried again, there is a man who failed and came back and earned the Green Beret. For every man who was medically dropped from BOD and felt like the question would never be answered, there is a man who recovered, returned, and found his answer. And for every man who failed selection and built a life outside the military that had nothing to do with the bell or the course or the sand or the water, there is a man who found that the qualities that drove him to try in the first place, the refusal to accept comfortable limits, the willingness to do what other people will not, the drive toward the hardest available option, those qualities were never specific to BODs. They were specific to him, and they went with him everywhere he went after. The bell ends a chapter. It does not end the book. And the men who understand that, who pick up their helmet from the row and walk away knowing that they are still fully themselves and that the rest of the story is still entirely theirs to write, those men are not failures. They are men who found their limit on one of the hardest courses ever designed by human beings and who refuse to let that limit be the last word. That takes something, maybe not the exact something that selection is looking for, but something real, something earned, something worth knowing. The military's most brutal selection weeks are designed to find the few, but they reveal something true to everyone who enters them. And what you do with that truth is, in the end, the only question that actually matters. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who has served or who is thinking about serving. Hit the like button, subscribe so you never miss what we put out next. This is the kind of story that deserves to be heard.